For 15 years, every Sunday, I was the one they trusted. With their hopes, their prayers, their donations. Then, one word from the pulpit shattered my world: thief. They built their lies on my good name. But what terrible secret were they desperate to hide? They thought I was broken. They never imagined I'd find the strength to unearth the truth and make them pay. My name is Sarah Jenkins, and the memory of that day, 5 years ago now, still feels like a shard of ice lodged near my heart. The day my church, the community I had poured my soul into, the people I considered my extended family, looked me in the eyes and branded me a thief. It's a label that clings, a shadow that follows, even when you know the truth. For 15 years, I had balanced their books with a devotion some might call obsessive. Every penny accounted for, every donation recorded with the kind of care I once reserved for tending the roses my late husband, Mark, had planted in our small garden. Then, Pastor Finch, a man whose sermons on integrity I had listened to with rapt attention, shattered my world with a single, devastating lie. Before that dreadful afternoon, my life in Havenwood, though quiet, was full. After Mark passed from a sudden heart attack a decade prior, the Havenwood Community Church became my sanctuary. It wasn't just a building, it was the warm embrace I needed, a place where shared faith and fellowship mended some of the raw edges of grief. I'd been a member for 30 years, and for the latter half of that time, I served as the volunteer treasurer. It was a role I took immensely seriously, a small way to give back to the community that had given me so much. My reputation, I thought, was as solid as the old oak tree in the churchyard, unshakable and deeply rooted in honesty. I was known for my meticulousness, perhaps a carryover from my years as a bookkeeper before retiring. Friends would joke that if a nickel went missing in Havenwood, Sarah Jenkins would find it. My lemon meringue pies were a staple at every church bake sale, usually the first to sell out. My small home, filled with the scent of baking and the quiet presence of Mark's photographs, was a place of peace. My daughter, Emily, lived a few states away, but we spoke often, and she knew how much my church life meant to me. It was my anchor, my purpose beyond my garden and my memories. My greatest passion within the church was the Hope and Future Fund. This was a project I had championed from its inception, a dream to build a new youth outreach center. I pictured a vibrant space where the young people of Havenwood could gather, find support, and perhaps discover their own passions. I'd spent countless hours organizing fundraisers, meticulously tracking donations, and dreaming of the day we'd break ground. It felt like a continuation of Mark's generous spirit, a legacy of hope we could build together, even with him gone. The fund represented more than just money, it was the embodiment of our community's aspirations. The day it all unraveled began like any other Tuesday. I was planning my grocery list, humming an old hymn, when the phone rang. It was Pastor Finch's secretary, asking if I could come to his study. There was no urgency in her voice, just a polite request. I assumed it was about the upcoming quarterly report for the Hope and Future Fund, perhaps a detail he wanted to discuss for the next newsletter. I tidied my hair, grabbed my ledger just in case, and walked the familiar path to the church, completely unsuspecting. The autumn air was crisp, and I remember thinking how beautiful the changing leaves looked against the clear blue sky. When I entered Pastor Finch's study, the atmosphere felt different, colder. He wasn't alone. Mr. Arthur Peterson, our head deacon, a man whose pronouncements often echoed the pastor's, sat stiffly in one of the plush chairs. Mrs. Diane Albright, the pastor's sister and the rather formidable head of the Women's Guild, was perched on the edge of another, her gaze sharp and unreadable. A knot of unease began to tighten in my stomach. Pastor Finch, usually so effusive with his greetings, gestured for me to sit with a somber expression that sent a chill down my spine. He began slowly, his voice laced with a theatrical sorrow that, even in my naivety, felt rehearsed. He spoke of stewardship, of trust, of the sacred duty to protect the church's resources. Then, he slid a printout across his polished desk. It was a summary of the Hope and Future Fund, but the numbers were wrong, terrifyingly so. He pointed to a significant shortfall, a figure exceeding $50,000, accumulated over the past 2 years. My breath caught in my throat. This had to be a mistake, a terrible accounting error. I tried to speak, to explain that his figures were incorrect, that my records were meticulous, but Pastor Finch held up a hand. He said, his voice now tinged with a sorrowful accusation, that after careful internal review, all evidence, unfortunately, pointed to me. Mr. Peterson nodded gravely, avoiding my eyes. Mrs. Albright sniffed, a small, sharp sound of condemnation. Thief. The word wasn't spoken aloud by them in that initial moment, but it hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. They were accusing me, Sarah Jenkins, of embezzling money from the very fund I cherished. My mind reeled. It felt as if the floor had dropped away, leaving me suspended in a horrifying void. I stammered, trying to deny it, to offer my ledgers, my meticulously kept records. I begged them to look again, to check their sources. How could this be? How could they believe this of me? My pleas were met with a united front of solemn regret and unshakable conviction. Pastor Finch said it pained him deeply, but the discrepancies were clear, and the responsibility lay with the treasurer. My 15 years of faithful service, my reputation, my very identity, seemed to crumble into dust in that oppressive, oak-paneled room. The shock was a physical blow, stealing my breath, clouding my vision. I felt a tremor start in my hands, a cold dread seeping into my bones. These people, who I had shared communion with, prayed alongside, trusted implicitly, were now my accusers. The very foundation of my world was cracking beneath my feet. The warmth of the church community, which had been my solace for so long, felt like it was receding, leaving me exposed and shivering in a sudden, bitter wind. The trust I had so carefully cultivated, the respect I had earned, all of it felt like it was being systematically dismantled before my very eyes. I remember stumbling out of Pastor Finch's study, though I have no clear recollection of how the meeting ended, or what final words were exchanged. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the familiar scent of beeswax and old hymnals suddenly cloying and unbearable. Each step was heavy, as if I were wading through thick, invisible mud. The faces of the congregation, the kind smiles I had taken for granted, now flashed in my mind as potential judges, their expressions twisted into masks of suspicion and disappointment. The weight of their unspoken verdict was already settling upon me, a crushing burden. The $50,000 felt like an impossible sum, a phantom figure conjured to destroy me. How could such a thing happen without my knowledge? My system was foolproof, or so I had believed. Every donation, no matter how small, was recorded, cross-referenced, and deposited. The meticulous nature that defined me now seemed to mock me. Was I losing my mind? Had I made some catastrophic error, some colossal misjudgment that had spiraled out of control without my awareness? The question swirled, a confusing and terrifying vortex, but deep down, a small, insistent voice whispered that this was wrong, that I had not done this. As I walked away from the church that day, leaving behind the hushed, accusatory atmosphere of Pastor Finch's study, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that my life had been irrevocably altered. The accusations, though still confined to that small room, felt like a disease that would soon spread, poisoning everything I held dear. The image of their faces, Pastor Finch's feigned sorrow, Mr. Peterson's averted gaze, Mrs. Albright's judgmental stare, burned into my memory. This was not just an error in accounting, this was a deliberate, calculated destruction. The walk home was a blur. The vibrant autumn leaves, which had seemed so beautiful just an hour before, now appeared garish, their colors too bright against the sudden darkness that had enveloped my world. I reached my small, empty house, the silence within its walls amplifying the turmoil in my soul. This was only the beginning, I realized with a sickening lurch. The accusation was a seed, and I had a dreadful premonition of the bitter fruit it was about to bear, a harvest of shame and isolation I could not yet fully comprehend. But even then, a tiny ember of defiance began to glow within the wreckage. They had started this, but I knew, somehow, I couldn't let it end this way. The fight for my name, for my truth, had just unknowingly begun, though the path ahead was terrifyingly obscure. The Sunday following that dreadful meeting in Pastor Finch's study felt like approaching a gallows. I didn't attend the service, I couldn't. The thought of facing the congregation, of seeing their knowing glances, was more than I could bear. But news, especially scandalous news in a town like Havenwood, travels faster than wildfire. My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who usually shared a cup of tea with me on Sunday afternoons, called with a strained voice, ostensibly to check if I was unwell. She relayed, with a mixture of feigned concern and ill-concealed curiosity, the gist of Pastor Finch's sermon. He hadn't named me directly, she said. Oh no, Pastor Finch was too clever for that. He spoke of significant financial irregularities that had been discovered, of a painful internal matter that was being handled with Christian charity but firm resolve. He asked for prayers for the church, for its healing and the restoration of integrity. Mrs. Henderson recounted how a heavy silence had fallen over the sanctuary, how heads had turned subtly, how whispers had rippled through the pews like an unseen current. No name was needed, everyone understood who the unnamed transgressor was. The treasurer, me. The following Monday, a crisply typed letter arrived by registered mail. It was from the church board, formally requesting my immediate resignation from the position of volunteer treasurer. The language was cold, impersonal, citing the ongoing investigation into financial discrepancies and the need to ensure full transparency and restore trust in the church's financial stewardship. There was no mention of my 15 years of dedicated service, no word of gratitude for the countless hours I had poured into their books. It was a dismissal, plain and simple, couched in bureaucratic terms that did little to soften the blow. I signed the resignation form with a hand that trembled, feeling as though I were signing away a part of my soul. The shunning began almost immediately, subtly at first, then with increasing blatancy. My usual morning walk to the bakery for a fresh loaf of bread became an ordeal. Mrs. Gable, who I'd known since I was a child, suddenly found the shop window across the street utterly fascinating as I approached. Young mothers I'd mentored in the church's nursery program would steer their strollers abruptly in another direction. In the grocery store, aisles would mysteriously empty as I entered, or conversations would cease, replaced by a pregnant silence and the weight of unseen eyes boring into my back. Each averted gaze, each whispered comment just out of earshot, was like a tiny pinprick, collectively bleeding me dry of my confidence and sense of belonging. Havenwood, once a place of comfort and familiarity, transformed into a landscape of accusation. The town itself felt hostile. The friendly nods from acquaintances became guarded stares. The cheerful greetings from shopkeepers were replaced by curt, professional exchanges. I was no longer Sarah Jenkins, the kind widow, the reliable church treasurer, the woman with the award-winning pies. I was an outcast, a pariah, defined by a crime I had not committed. The loneliness was a physical ache, a constant companion that sat with me at my empty dinner table and lay beside me in my too large bed. Even my small comforts were tainted. My garden, once a source of joy, now felt like a place of exposure. Neighbors I'd shared seedlings with for years now kept their distance, their curtains twitching as I tended my roses. I stopped baking, there was no one to share with, and the familiar motions brought only a hollow echo of happier times. The church, my spiritual home, was now a source of profound pain, its steeple a constant reminder of the betrayal I had endured. I felt adrift, unmoored from everything that had once given my life structure and meaning. The most painful consequence, however, was the strain it placed on my relationship with Emily. She called a few days after Pastor Finch's sermon, her voice tight with confusion and distress. Rumors had reached her, garbled and exaggerated, but the core accusation was clear. "Mom," she'd asked, her uncertainty a knife in my heart, "what's going on?" "People are saying. They're saying you took money from the church." I tried to explain, to tell her it was a lie, a terrible mistake, but the shame was so profound, my words felt weak and unconvincing even to my own ears. Emily wanted to believe me, I know she did. But the weight of an entire church community's condemnation, the authority of a pastor, it was a heavy counterpoint to my desperate denials. She lived so far away, and the distance seemed to magnify her doubts. Our conversations became stilted, fraught with unspoken questions and a painful awareness of the chasm that had opened between us. She loved me, but I could hear the struggle in her voice, the difficulty of reconciling the mother she knew with the thief the world was now telling her I was. Each call left me feeling more desolate, more alone. The shame was a corrosive acid, eating away at my self-esteem. I began to internalize the accusations, to question my own sanity. Had I been careless? Had I missed something vital? The meticulous records I had prided myself on now seemed like a testament to my failure. Sleep offered little respite, my nights filled with anxious dreams of falling, of being pursued, of numbers that wouldn't add up. My reflection in the mirror showed a stranger, a woman with haunted eyes and a permanent frown etched into her features. The vibrant, engaged woman I once was had faded, replaced by a shadow of her former self. My faith, which had been my bedrock through Mark's death and the lonely years that followed, was deeply shaken. How could a loving God allow such injustice? How could his house, a place of supposed sanctuary, become a den of lies and false witness? I prayed, but my prayers felt like they were bouncing off a brass ceiling, unheard and unanswered. The silence from heaven was as deafening as the whispers of the town. I felt abandoned, not just by my community, but by the very divine presence I had trusted all my life. The weight of the accusation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I rarely left my house except for essential errands, and even then, I moved like a ghost, trying to be invisible. The vibrant colors of my life had leached away, leaving behind a monochrome existence of grief, shame, and a profound, aching loneliness. The church's annual fall festival, an event I had once joyfully helped organize, came and went, and I watched from my window as families walked by, their laughter a painful reminder of the life I had lost. This wasn't just a loss of reputation, it was a loss of identity. My role as treasurer, my involvement in the church, these things had been integral to who I was. Stripped of them, I felt like a ship without a rudder, drifting aimlessly in a sea of despair. The injustice was a constant, throbbing ache, a wound that refused to heal. They had not just accused me of stealing money, they had stolen my peace, my joy, my very sense of self. The silence from the church leadership was absolute. There were no further communications, no updates on their investigation. It was as if I had ceased to exist for them, except as a cautionary tale, a symbol of fallen integrity. The finality of it was crushing. There was no appeal, no recourse, just the cold, hard reality of my new life as Havenwood's pariah. And so, the days bled into weeks, the weeks into months. The initial shock gave way to a dull, persistent ache of despair. I was trapped in a narrative someone else had written for me, a story of deceit and betrayal. Little did I know then, as I sat in my silent house, that this crushing weight of injustice would, one day, become the very fuel that would ignite a desperate search for the truth, a truth more shocking than anyone in Havenwood could ever imagine. The seeds of my ruin had been sown, but within them, unknowingly, lay the dormant potential for a very different kind of harvest. 2 years. 2 long, desolate years passed under the heavy cloak of that accusation. Time, which is often said to heal all wounds, seemed only to etch the lines of shame deeper into my face and soul. I had settled into a reclusive existence, my world shrinking to the confines of my small house and garden. The vibrant Sarah Jenkins who organized bake sales and balanced church ledgers with a song in her heart was a distant memory, a ghost of a former self. I was simply that woman, the one who had betrayed her church. The label, unspoken but ever present, was a heavy anchor. My contact with the outside world was minimal. Emily called, of course, and her calls were a lifeline, though still tinged with that unspoken sorrow and a careful avoidance of the topic that hung between us like a permanent fog. Occasionally, I would venture to the local diner, the corner booth, for a cup of coffee and a slice of pie, usually at off-peak hours when it was mostly empty. It was one of the few places where the stares felt less pointed, perhaps because old Mr. Henderson, the owner, had known Mark and me since we were young and always treated me with a quiet, impartial courtesy. It was on one such dreary November afternoon, huddled in my usual corner booth with a lukewarm coffee, that the first tiny crack appeared in the wall of my despair. Mrs. Diane Albright, Pastor Finch's sister and one of my most vocal, albeit indirect, accusers, swept into the diner with a flourish, accompanied by Mrs. Crowley, another prominent member of the Women's Guild. They didn't see me tucked away in the back, and their voices, never known for their subtlety, carried easily across the room. Mrs. Albright was holding forth, her tone a mixture of self-importance and vicarious pride, about Pastor Finch and his wife's recent anniversary trip. "Oh, it was simply divine, Agnes," she declared, loud enough for half the diner to hear. "A 2-week tour of the European capitals. Paris, Rome, Vienna. Alistair said it was a much-needed blessing, a true gift from the Lord after all the church's financial trials and the unpleasantness, you know." She lowered her voice conspiratorially for the last part, but not enough. "He said it was vital for his spirit, to recharge for the Lord's work." A thought, small and unwelcome at first, pricked at the edges of my mind. A 2-week tour of European capitals. Pastor Finch's salary, while comfortable for Havenwood, was modest. The church itself had been pleading poverty ever since the unpleasantness, constantly emphasizing the need for increased tithes to recover from the supposed deficit I had caused. Where would the money for such an extravagant trip have come from? It was a fleeting question, one I almost dismissed as bitter speculation, born of my own pain. After all, perhaps they had saved diligently, or received a generous gift. But the thought, once planted, refused to be entirely uprooted. It was a tiny splinter of unease, a dissonant note in the carefully constructed narrative of Pastor Finch's humble servitude and the church's ongoing financial struggles. I tried to push it away. It was none of my business. My focus needed to be on my own quiet survival, not on the pastor's vacation plans. Yet, the image of him, a man who had so righteously condemned me for financial impropriety, enjoying such a lavish holiday while the church supposedly scraped by, left a bitter taste in my mouth. For a brief, foolish moment, my mind even drifted to Mr. Peterson, the head deacon who had sat in judgment beside Pastor Finch. I knew he'd had some business setbacks a few years prior. Could he have been more deeply involved in some financial trouble, perhaps pressuring Finch to find funds, leading to the whole scapegoating scenario? It was a wild, unfounded theory, and it didn't quite fit. Mr. Peterson, for all his bluster, seemed more like a follower than a mastermind. The pastor was the one with the charisma, the influence, the one who controlled the narrative. This tiny seed of doubt was not hope, not yet. It was more like a faint stirring in a long-dormant part of my brain, the part that used to analyze numbers and look for inconsistencies. For 2 years, I had accepted the version of events presented to me, not because I believed I was guilty, but because the force of the accusation had been so overwhelming, so utterly crushing, that it had seemed futile to fight. My own internal voice of reason had been silenced by the louder, more confident voices of my accusers. But Mrs. Albright's boast, unintended and casual as it was, had inadvertently nudged something loose. It was the first time in 2 years that a piece of information didn't quite align with the official story I had been force-fed. It was a small thing, easily explained away, perhaps. But it was there. A question mark in a narrative that had, until then, seemed so tragically, unalterably complete. I paid for my coffee and left the diner, the conversation still echoing in my ears. The wind outside felt a little sharper, the gray sky a little more oppressive. Yet, amidst the familiar gloom, there was something new, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift in my internal landscape. It wasn't a plan, not even a conscious decision to act. It was simply a question, a fragile, tentative what if. What if the story wasn't as straightforward as they had made it seem? The injustice of it all still felt like a lead weight in my chest. That feeling, the raw wound of being falsely accused, never truly left. Have you ever felt that kind of helplessness, that crushing weight when a lie takes on a life of its own, and you're left standing in the ruins, wondering if the truth will ever see the light of day? It's a lonely place to be, a silence that screams. That tiny question about Pastor Finch's trip was the first flicker of a candle in that vast darkness, a darkness I had inhabited for so long. I didn't know then where that flicker would lead, or if it would be snuffed out as quickly as it had appeared. The path ahead was still shrouded in fog. But for the first time in 2 very long years, there was something other than just pain and resignation. There was a question. And questions, I was slowly beginning to remember, sometimes have a way of demanding answers, no matter how deeply they are buried. The foundation of their lies had just sustained its first, almost invisible, hairline crack. Another year crawled by, each day barely distinguishable from the last. The tiny crack of doubt, born from Mrs. Albright's careless words in the diner, remained just that, a hairline fracture in the solid wall of my despair. It hadn't widened, hadn't led to any revelations. Life continued in its muted, solitary rhythm. I had almost resigned myself to this quiet purgatory, a life lived in the shadows of an unshakable accusation. The will to fight, if it had ever truly existed, had withered under the relentless weight of shame and isolation. Then came the announcement from Havenwood Community Church. It was plastered on the community notice board outside the grocery store, a large, professionally printed banner heralding a new, aggressive fundraising campaign, Sacrifice for a Secure Future. The campaign, spearheaded by Pastor Finch himself, aimed to rebuild what was lost through past trials and secure our ministry for generations to come. The implication was clear: the church was still suffering from the financial devastation I had supposedly wrought 3 years prior, and further sacrifices were now required from the congregation. A morbid curiosity, mixed with the familiar pang of injustice, drew me to the church the following Sunday. It was the first time I had set foot inside the sanctuary since that fateful meeting in Pastor Finch's study. I slipped into a back pew just as the service was beginning, hoping to remain unnoticed. The church was fuller than I expected, the atmosphere charged with a fervent energy. Pastor Finch was in his element, his voice booming from the pulpit, his gestures expansive and impassioned. His sermon that morning was on the high cost of dishonesty and the blessings of unwavering integrity. He spoke of wolves in sheep's clothing, of betrayals that cut deeper than any knife, of the sacred trust that, once broken, required immense effort to restore. His gaze, sweeping across the congregation, seemed to linger for a moment on the back pew where I sat, a subtle but unmistakable acknowledgement of my presence, a fresh twist of the knife. The hypocrisy was a suffocating wave, and I had to clench my fists to stop myself from crying out. The true breaking point, however, came not during the sermon, but later that week. I was at the post office, mailing a small birthday package to Emily, when I witnessed a scene that finally shattered my hard-won apathy. Pastor Finch was there, cornering Mrs. Gable, a frail, elderly widow who had been a dear friend of my late mother. Mrs. Gable lived on a meager pension, her health was failing, and she was known for her gentle nature and her susceptibility to persuasion. Pastor Finch's voice, usually so smooth and comforting, had an undercurrent of firm pressure as he spoke to her about the Sacrifice for a Secure Future campaign. I couldn't hear every word, but I saw Mrs. Gable's distressed expression, her hesitant nods as Pastor Finch, with a benevolent smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, urged her to consider a legacy pledge, a substantial donation from her small savings. He spoke of heavenly rewards, of storing up treasures where moth and rust do not corrupt. I saw Mrs. Gable, looking flustered and overwhelmed, eventually agree, her hand trembling as she clutched her worn purse. Watching that exchange, seeing the blatant manipulation of a vulnerable old woman by the very man who had destroyed my life and was now using my alleged crime as a pretext to solicit more funds, ignited something within me. It wasn't just about my own ruined reputation anymore. It was about the ongoing deception, the exploitation of faith, the harm being inflicted upon others, upon people like Mrs. Gable who were too kind or too intimidated to resist. A cold, hard rage, an emotion I hadn't felt with such intensity in years, solidified in my chest. This was the catalyst. This was the unbearable injustice that finally pushed me over the edge. The years of silent suffering, the internalized shame, the weary resignation, it all burned away in that moment, replaced by a fierce, protective anger. How dare he? How dare he continue to wear the mantle of righteousness while preying on the very flock he was sworn to protect? How dare he use my fabricated guilt as a tool for his own enrichment or, at the very least, for his continued deception? That evening, I didn't sleep. The image of Mrs. Gable's anxious face, of Pastor Finch's predatory piety, replayed in my mind. My own suffering had been a private agony, but seeing him target others, seeing the potential for more lives to be damaged by his hypocrisy, was a different matter entirely. It was no longer enough to simply know in my heart that I was innocent. I had to prove it. I had to expose him for what he truly was, not just for my own sake, but for Mrs. Gable, for the integrity of the faith he was sullying, for the community he was deceiving. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. Pastor Finch was a powerful, influential man in Havenwood. He had the support of the church leadership, the trust of the congregation. I was a discredited outcast. What chance did I have against him? But the anger, the righteous indignation, was stronger. It was a fire in my veins, a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt since before the accusation. The passivity was gone, replaced by a grim, unyielding determination. I sat at my kitchen table as the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, a plan, vague and uncertain, beginning to form in my mind. I didn't know how I would do it, what steps I would take, but I knew, with an absolute certainty that resonated deep in my bones, that I could not, would not, let this stand. The years of being a silent victim were over. Pastor Finch had made a grave miscalculation. He had pushed me too far. He had awakened a part of Sarah Jenkins he clearly believed was long dead and buried. The breaking point hadn't been a single, dramatic event concerning my own plight, but rather the slow accumulation of injustices, culminating in that public display of manipulation. It was the realization that his deceit was an ongoing malignancy, and I was, perhaps, the only one who had a glimpse of its true nature, however faint. The fight wouldn't be easy, and the odds were stacked against me, but the alternative, to do nothing, to let his lies continue to fester and harm others, was simply unthinkable. My journey from passive victim to active seeker of truth had begun, fueled by the fire of an injustice that had finally become too great to bear. The decision to act, born from that raw anger and a renewed sense of justice, was one thing. Figuring out how to act was another entirely. Pastor Finch had woven his narrative of my guilt so tightly, had controlled the information so completely, that unraveling it seemed like an impossible task. I had no evidence, no allies, only a deep-seated conviction of my innocence and a growing suspicion about his integrity. Where does one even begin to dismantle a lie that has stood for 3 years, a lie believed by an entire community? I spent days pacing my small living room, my mind racing. I needed a starting point, a loose thread, anything that might lead me to the truth. My own meticulously kept ledgers from my time as treasurer had been handed over to the church board during their investigation. I had no copies. I had trusted the system, trusted that truth would prevail. A bitter laugh escaped me at the memory of my naivety. That trust had been my undoing. Then, a name surfaced from the depths of my memory, faint and almost forgotten: Carol Baxter. Carol had been a young woman, bright and efficient, who had worked as a part-time church secretary and assistant bookkeeper for about a year. Her tenure had overlapped with the period when the supposed discrepancies in the Hope and Future Fund began. She had left Havenwood abruptly, around the same time the accusations against me were solidifying, citing personal reasons and moving to a city several states away. At the time, her departure had barely registered amidst my own turmoil. Now, it seemed significant. Finding Carol Baxter in this digital age, I reasoned, might not be impossible. I rarely use the internet beyond checking emails from Emily or looking up gardening tips, but I knew it was a vast repository of information. I went to the Havenwood Public Library, a place I hadn't frequented much since the accusation, the librarian's polite but distant greeting a small reminder of my altered status. With fumbling fingers, I typed Carol's name into a social media search engine. Page after page of results appeared, but after an hour of scrolling through profiles, one picture made me pause: a smiling young woman with the same distinctive auburn hair, standing in front of a landmark I recognized from the city she'd supposedly moved to. My heart hammered against my ribs. It had to be her. I sent a hesitant message, a brief introduction, reminding her of our time at Havenwood Community Church, and asked if she might be willing to speak with me. I didn't mention the accusations, not yet. I simply said I was trying to understand some things from that period. Days passed with no reply. I checked my messages obsessively, my hope dwindling with each passing hour. Had she forgotten me? Or worse, did she believe the lies too? Then, one evening, a notification popped up. A message from Carol Baxter. It was short, cautious. She remembered me. She asked what I wanted to talk about. I replied, carefully wording my request, explaining that I was trying to piece together a clearer picture of the church's financial handling during her time there, that there were still unanswered questions for me. After another exchange, she agreed to a phone call the following Saturday. The small victory felt monumental. The days leading up to that call were filled with a nervous anticipation. What if she knew nothing? What if she refused to get involved? When Saturday finally arrived, I clutched the phone, my palms sweating. Carol's voice, when she answered, was friendly but guarded. I started by asking general questions about her time at the church, her responsibilities, her impressions. She spoke of Pastor Finch with a certain reserve, describing him as charming and very persuasive, but also, she admitted after a pause, a bit too smooth for her liking. Gently, I steered the conversation towards the church finances, specifically the handling of cash donations, a significant portion of the Hope and Future Fund contributions. Carol hesitated, then sighed. That was always a bit odd, she confessed. Pastor Finch often handled the larger cash donations himself, especially those that came in outside of the Sunday service offering. He'd say he was taking them to his office for safekeeping before they were officially recorded and deposited. He was very particular about that. My pulse quickened. This was new. In my time as treasurer, all donations, cash or check, were supposed to be counted by two people and recorded immediately. Pastor Finch directly handling large sums of cash before official recording was a deviation from protocol, a significant one. Did that strike you as unusual? I asked, trying to keep my voice even. At the time, I just assumed it was his way of maintaining control, being thorough, Carol said. He was the pastor, after all. But she did add something else, a detail that seemed almost an afterthought to her, but struck me like a bolt of lightning. He also made quite a few discreet trips, usually midweek, to a larger city about 2 hours' drive from Havenwood. He'd say he was meeting with denominational leaders or attending seminars, but he was always vague about the specifics. My mind raced. Discreet trips. Handling cash donations personally? This wasn't just about a discrepancy, this was about opportunity, about a pattern of behavior that could easily facilitate wrongdoing. Then Carol dropped the most crucial piece of information, a name I had never encountered in all my years of handling the church's finances. I remember him mentioning a financial consultant he sometimes met with on those trips, she said thoughtfully. A Mr. Rexford, I think it was. Said he was helping the church explore new investment avenues for its long-term stability. Mr. Rexford. The name was utterly unfamiliar. No such consultant had ever been engaged by the church board, not officially. No payments to a Mr. Rexford had ever crossed my desk. My mind seized on this. A secret financial consultant? Meetings in another city. This was more than just a loose thread, this was a tangible lead, a pathway into the shadows where Pastor Finch operated. Carol, perhaps sensing the sudden intensity in my silence, added that she had always felt a little uneasy about those trips and the vague explanations. After thanking Carol profusely for her time and her honesty, I hung up the phone, my mind buzzing. Carol Baxter, the young secretary who had left Havenwood under a cloud of unspoken reasons, had just handed me the first concrete piece of a puzzle I was desperate to solve. Pastor Finch's carefully constructed facade of piety and fiscal responsibility was beginning to show cracks, and the name Mr. Rexford felt like a key that might unlock the truth behind the $50,000 missing dollars in my ruined life. The investigation had truly begun, and for the first time, I felt a sliver of empowerment, a sense that I was no longer just a passive recipient of injustice, but an active seeker of truth. The darkness was still vast, but now, I had a direction in which to shine my small, flickering light. The name Mr. Rexford echoed in my mind for days after my conversation with Carol Baxter. It was a foreign element in the familiar landscape of Havenwood Community Church's finances, a name that had no business being associated with our modest, locally managed funds. My next step was clear. I needed to find out who this mysterious financial consultant was, and what possible connection he could have to Pastor Alistair Finch and, more importantly, to the church's missing money. Once again, I found myself at the Havenwood Public Library, the computer terminal my gateway to a world far beyond our small town. My internet search skills were still rudimentary, but fueled by a desperate need for answers, I typed Mr. Rexford financial consultant and the name of the nearby city Carol had mentioned into the search bar. The results were, at first, unhelpfully broad. But as I refined my search, adding terms like investment and Havenwood, a website eventually surfaced. It was for a company called Rexford Capital Ventures. The website was flashy, filled with impressive-sounding jargon about emerging markets, synergistic growth opportunities, and bespoke wealth management solutions. Mr. Jonathan Rexford, presumably the Mr. Rexford Carroll had mentioned, was listed as the CEO and founder, his photograph exuding an air of slick confidence and prosperity. There were testimonials, glowing with praise for Rexford's financial acumen, but they were all attributed to vague entities like a private investor or a satisfied consortium. Something about the site felt insubstantial, all style and little substance. I delved deeper, moving beyond the company's polished self-presentation. I started searching for news articles, forum discussions, anything that might offer a more objective view of Mr. Rexford and his ventures. It took hours of patient sifting, but gradually, a more disturbing picture began to emerge. Scattered across various financial watchdog sites and obscure online forums were mentions of Rexford Capital Ventures in connection with several high-risk investment schemes that had ultimately collapsed, leaving investors with significant losses. There were accusations of misrepresentation, of unsustainable promises, even whispers of outright fraud, though, frustratingly, no record of any actual convictions. A cold dread began to creep over me as I connected the dots. Pastor Finch, a man entrusted with the sacred donations of his congregation, secretly meeting with a consultant whose business practices seemed questionable at best, and predatory at worst? The $50,000 I was accused of stealing suddenly seemed like a relatively small sum in the context of the potentially much larger sums Pastor Finch might have been channeling into Rexford's risky schemes. The new investment avenues Carroll had mentioned took on a sinister new meaning. The horrifying truth began to crystallize in my mind, piece by sickening piece. Pastor Finch hadn't just needed a scapegoat to cover a simple shortfall or a minor indiscretion. It was far worse than that. He had likely been gambling with the church's money, perhaps initially with small amounts, trying to generate quick returns through Rexford's speculative ventures. When those investments inevitably soured, or when Rexford's schemes began to unravel, Finch would have been desperate, facing not just financial ruin for the church but personal exposure and disgrace. The missing $50,000 from the Hope and Future Fund, the fund I had poured my heart into, was likely just one part of a much larger, ongoing deception. He must have been siphoning off cash donations, the untraceable funds Carroll mentioned he handled personally, and feeding them into Rexford's maw. My meticulously kept records, which would have shown the legitimate income and expenditures, would have made the growing black hole obvious if anyone had scrutinized them closely enough before he could cook the overarching books. He needed someone to blame, someone with access, someone trusted. I was the perfect, unsuspecting target. For a fleeting moment, a different, almost sympathetic thought crossed my mind. What if Pastor Finch himself was a victim of Rexford's manipulations? What if he had been duped, his good intentions leading him into a disastrous financial entanglement he couldn't escape? But Carroll's description of his secretive behavior, his direct handling of cash, his frequent, unexplained trips, and his carefully constructed narrative of my guilt, it all pointed to active, calculated complicity, not naive victimhood. He wasn't just covering losses, he was perpetuating a fraud and had deliberately sacrificed me to save himself. The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. This wasn't just about my stolen reputation, it was about a profound abuse of trust, a desecration of faith for personal gain or to cover desperate acts. The pastor, the spiritual leader of our community, was potentially a con man, or at the very least, a reckless gambler who had used the church's sacred funds as his personal casino chips. The anger I had felt before now mingled with a profound sense of nausea. The man who preached about integrity from the pulpit was living a lie of monumental proportions. The why behind the false accusation was now chillingly clear. It wasn't personal animosity towards me, not directly. It was a calculated act of self-preservation. He needed to create a diversion, a plausible explanation for the missing funds before the entire house of cards collapsed. By framing me, he not only found his scapegoat but also reinforced his image as a vigilant leader uncovering wrongdoing, further cementing his control and deflecting any potential scrutiny from his own actions. I sat back from the library computer, the harsh fluorescent light suddenly feeling oppressive. The information I had uncovered was explosive, but it was also largely circumstantial, gleaned from the shadowy corners of the internet. I had no concrete proof linking Pastor Finch directly to Rexford, no paper trail, nothing beyond Carol's recollections and my own deductions. The battle ahead was still immense. Knowing the truth in my heart was one thing, proving it to a world that had already judged and condemned me was another entirely. The weight of this new knowledge was immense. Pastor Finch wasn't just a man who had made a mistake or told a single lie. He was potentially a systematic defrauder, a manipulator of the highest order. The $50,000 was likely just the tip of the iceberg. The man who had destroyed my life was not just a pastor who had stumbled, he was a wolf in shepherd's clothing, preying on the faith and trust of his flock. My resolve hardened. This was bigger than me. This was about protecting others from his continued deceit. The initial shock was now morphing into a cold, determined fury. He had unmasked himself in my eyes, and I would not rest until his true face was revealed to everyone. The library felt too small, the air too thin. I gathered my few printed notes, my hand shaking slightly, not from fear this time, but from the enormity of what I had discovered and the daunting task that lay ahead. The path to justice was still long and treacherous, but for the first time, I felt like I had a map, however crude, to navigate the darkness. The true villain had been unmasked, at least in my mind, and his motives laid bare. Now, I had to find a way to show the world what I had seen. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? How someone in a position of such trust can weave such a complex web of deceit. If you're finding this story compelling, perhaps take a moment to subscribe to our channel for more true stories of resilience and the search for justice. You never know whose quiet strength might inspire you next. Now, back to how I plan to confront this monster. The discovery of Pastor Finch's probable dealings with the dubious Mr. Rexford, and the horrifying realization of the likely scale of his deception, left me reeling but also strangely energized. The vague suspicions had solidified into a chilling, plausible theory. For 3 years, I had been adrift in a sea of confusion and shame, but now, I had a target, a motive, and a burning sense of purpose. However, knowing the truth and proving it were two vastly different undertakings. My word against the esteemed Pastor Alistair Finch, a man who had so thoroughly convinced Havenwood of my guilt, would amount to nothing without irrefutable evidence. I spent the next few weeks in a state of intense, almost obsessive, contemplation. How could I possibly obtain the kind of proof that would not only clear my name but also expose Pastor Finch for the charlatan he was? He was clever, cautious, and had already demonstrated his ruthlessness in protecting himself. Any direct confrontation without concrete evidence would be disastrous, likely dismissed as the ramblings of a bitter, disgraced woman. I needed something undeniable, something that would shatter his carefully crafted image of piety and integrity. My mind kept returning to Carol Baxter's account of Pastor Finch handling large cash donations personally, taking them to his office for safekeeping. If he was siphoning off these funds for his dealings with Rexford, or to cover gambling losses as I now suspected, he would need to keep some record of these illicit transactions, however rudimentary. He couldn't rely solely on memory for such significant amounts and complex deceptions. Official church records would have been doctored, of course, or would simply not reflect these clandestine activities. But a man like Finch, so meticulous in his public persona, would likely have a private system for tracking his ill-gotten gains and his desperate maneuvers. The thought of his church study, the very room where my life had been so callously dismantled, became a focal point. He had a large, antique wooden cabinet in that study, a piece he often referred to as his private records cabinet. It was always kept locked. At the time, I'd assumed it held confidential pastoral counseling notes or personal correspondence. Now, a different possibility emerged. What if that cabinet was where he kept his real ledgers, the ones that detailed the truth of his financial machinations? The ones that would incriminate him and exonerate me? The idea was audacious, terrifying even. To attempt to gain access to Pastor Finch's private study, to his locked cabinet, was fraught with risk. If I were caught, it would not only destroy any chance I had of clearing my name but would also reinforce the narrative of me as a desperate, untrustworthy individual. It could even lead to legal trouble. Yet, the more I considered it, the more it seemed like my only viable option. Where else would such incriminating evidence be hidden? His home was a possibility, but gaining access there was even more improbable. The church study, while still a fortress, felt slightly more assailable. My plan began to form, a desperate gambit born of necessity. I would need to find a time when the church was relatively empty but Pastor Finch was occupied, a time when his study might be unattended for a short period. The Wednesday evening Bible study came to mind. It was a smaller gathering, usually held in the main fellowship hall, and Pastor Finch always led it himself. During that hour, his study was typically dark and quiet. My objective wouldn't be to steal anything. I wasn't a thief, despite the label he had pinned on me. My goal would be to find and photograph any incriminating documents, ledgers detailing cash transactions that never made it to the official books, correspondence with Rexford, betting slips, anything that could substantiate my theory. Photographs, I reasoned, would be irrefutable. They would be my weapons in this fight for truth. This wouldn't be a vengeful act of destruction, but a calculated exposure. My revenge, if one could call it that, would be the simple, unadorned truth laid bare for all to see. The decision to proceed filled me with a mixture of trepidation and a grim resolve. This was a significant escalation, a move from passive suffering and quiet investigation to active, risky intervention. For years, I had been the victim of Finch's actions. Now, I was choosing to become an agent in my own vindication, to take control of the narrative that had been stolen from me. The Sarah Jenkins who meticulously balanced books was now planning a clandestine operation, a thought that would have been unimaginable to me just a few years prior. I began to prepare, mentally and practically. I studied the layout of the church from memory, visualizing the path to Finch's study, the potential hiding places, the escape routes. I considered the lock on his cabinet. It was an old piece of furniture. The lock was likely simple, not a high-security mechanism. This led me down another unfamiliar path, researching basic lock-picking techniques online. The irony was not lost on me. The woman accused of stealing money was now learning skills more commonly associated with burglars, all in the pursuit of justice. The internal conflict was immense. Every fiber of my being, conditioned by a lifetime of honesty and rule-following, recoiled from the idea of such surreptitious actions. But then the image of Mrs. Gable's distressed face would flash in my mind, or the memory of Pastor Finch's sanctimonious pronouncements from the pulpit, and my resolve would harden. He had left me no other choice. He had used deceit and manipulation to destroy my life and defraud his congregation. Exposing him required methods I would never have otherwise countenanced. My motivation was no longer just about clearing my own name, though that remained a powerful driver. It was about accountability. It was about ensuring that Pastor Finch could no longer hide behind his clerical collar, no longer exploit the faith and trust of good, unsuspecting people. It was about restoring a semblance of integrity to a community he had so profoundly betrayed. The potential consequences for me were severe, but the consequences of inaction, of allowing his deception to continue unchallenged, felt even more dire. The blueprint for my reckoning was taking shape. It was a dangerous, desperate plan, one with a high probability of failure. But it was a plan nonetheless. And for the first time since that devastating accusation, I felt a flicker of power, a sense that I was no longer just a pawn in Pastor Finch's game. I was about to make my own move, to step out of the shadows and fight back with the only weapon I had left, the desperate hope of uncovering the truth, whatever the cost. The quiet, broken woman was preparing for battle. The Wednesday evening arrived cloaked in a nervous, oppressive humidity that mirrored my own internal state. Every nerve in my body felt frayed, stretched taut like an overwound violin string. Attending the Bible study felt like walking into the lion's den, but it was a necessary part of the charade, the only way to create the opportunity I so desperately needed. I slipped into a seat at the very back of the fellowship hall, my heart hammering against my ribs with a force that made me fear it was audible. Pastor Finch stood at the front, his voice smooth and authoritative as he expounded on the virtues of honesty and transparency from the book of Proverbs. The irony was a bitter pill. I feigned rapt attention, my eyes fixed on the pastor, while my mind raced, rehearsing every step of my plan. The fellowship hall was adjacent to the main corridor that led past the church offices, including Pastor Finch's study. I had a small, old digital camera in my purse, its battery fully charged, and a tiny set of lockpicks I'd ordered online under a pseudonym and had delivered to a post office box in a neighboring town. Holding them, even concealed in my bag, made me feel like an entirely different person, a stranger to myself. About 20 minutes into the study, as Pastor Finch was deep into a particularly convoluted explanation of a biblical passage, I saw my chance. I began to cough, softly at first, then with increasing, theatrical urgency, pressing a handkerchief to my mouth. Heads turned. Pastor Finch paused, a slight frown creasing his brow. With a mumbled apology about needing some water and not wanting to disturb the group further, I rose and quickly exited the fellowship hall, trying to look merely unwell rather than like a woman on a desperate, clandestine mission. The corridor was dimly lit and mercifully empty. My footsteps echoed unnervingly on the polished linoleum floor as I hurried towards Pastor Finch's study. The door was unlocked, as I had hoped. I slipped inside, my breath catching in my throat, and gently closed it behind me, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the faint glow filtering in from the corridor lights under the door. For a moment, I stood frozen, my eyes adjusting, listening for any sound, any indication that I had been seen or heard. Only the frantic thumping of my own heart broke the silence. The large, antique cabinet stood against the far wall, a dark, imposing presence. This was it. My hands fumbled in my purse for the lockpicks. They felt alien in my fingers, clumsy and unfamiliar. I had practiced on old locks at home, but this was different. The fear of discovery, the ticking clock of the Bible study progressing just a room away, made my fingers slick with sweat. The first pick I tried snapped, the tiny piece of metal clattering softly onto the rug, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. Panic flared, hot and sharp. Just as I was struggling with another pick, I heard footsteps in the corridor, accompanied by a cheerful, off-key humming. My blood ran cold. It was Mrs. Albright. Her humming grew louder as she approached the study. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide effectively in the small, cluttered room. In a desperate, instinctive move, I squeezed myself into the narrow gap between the large, heavy desk and the wall, pressing myself flat, praying the shadows would conceal me. My heart felt like it would explode. Mrs. Albright's shadow fell across the frosted glass panel of the study door. She paused right outside, her humming momentarily ceasing. I held my breath, certain she would open the door, certain she would see me. Was this it? Was my desperate gamble over before it had even truly begun? After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, her humming resumed, and her footsteps receded down the corridor towards the restrooms. I let out a shaky, silent breath, my muscles trembling with relief and residual terror. The close call spurred me into renewed action. There was no more time for fumbling. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled focus, I inserted another pick into the cabinet lock. I manipulated it gently, listening, feeling for the telltale click I had read about. And then, almost miraculously, it happened. A soft snick, and the small brass knob turned freely in my hand. The cabinet door creaked open. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold my small camera steady. Inside, it wasn't pastoral notes or personal correspondence. It was exactly as I had dared to hope, yet feared to find. There were several ledgers, different from the official church account books I knew so well. One, bound in cheap black plastic, was filled with columns of handwritten numbers, dates, cash amounts, and cryptic notations like "arpompt," market adjective, or casino trip re-emb. The amounts were staggering, far exceeding the $50,000 I had been accused of. This was the shadow account, the record of his secret financial life. Tucked beneath the ledgers was a bundle of betting slips from a well-known casino in the city Mr. Rexford supposedly operated from, the dates aligning with some of Pastor Finch's midweek seminars. There were also printouts of emails between Finch and J. Rexford, discussing investment performance and mitigation strategies in veiled, cautious language. This was it. This was the irrefutable proof I needed. With trembling fingers, I began to photograph every page, every slip, every email. the quiet click of the camera shutter sounding like a cannon blast in the stillness of the room. I worked with frantic speed, my gaze darting nervously towards the door every few seconds. My mind struggled to absorb the full extent of his depravity, the sheer audacity of his betrayal, even as I documented it. Just as I photographed the last page of the black ledger, I heard the distant sounds of chairs scraping and voices rising in the fellowship hall. The Bible study was ending. Panic seized me again. I hastily shoved the ledgers and papers back into the cabinet, perhaps not as neatly as I'd found them, slammed the door shut, and twisted the knob, hoping the lock had re-engaged. There was no time to check. I slipped out of the study, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and hurried back down the corridor, trying to compose myself, to look like someone who had merely been to the water fountain. I re-entered the fellowship hall just as people were beginning to disperse, offering a weak smile and a murmured apology to those nearest the door. No one seemed to pay me any particular mind. Pastor Finch was at the front, basking in the post-study adulation of a few remaining congregants. He didn't even glance my way. I had done it. I had walked into the lion's den, faced discovery, and emerged, however shaken, with the evidence that could finally bring his reign of deceit to an end. The small camera in my purse suddenly felt like the heaviest, most precious object I had ever possessed. The fear was still there, but now it was overlaid with a wild, improbable sense of triumph. The gamble had paid off. The execution had been fraught with tension, teetering on the brink of disaster, but I had the proof. Now, the real battle, the public confrontation, was about to begin. The days following my terrifying foray into Pastor Finch's study were a blur of nervous energy and meticulous preparation. The digital images on the camera's memory card were my arsenal, each photograph a bullet aimed at the heart of Finch's carefully constructed empire of lies. The sheer weight of what I possessed was almost unbearable. I knew I couldn't keep it to myself for long, nor did I want to. The need for justice, for public vindication, burned too fiercely. My daughter, Emily, was my first and most crucial confidant. I called her, my voice trembling as I recounted the events of the past few weeks, from tracking down Carol Baxter to the heart-stopping moments in Pastor Finch's study. I emailed her copies of the photographs, the damning ledgers, the betting slips, the veiled emails to Rexford. There was a long silence on her end after she reviewed them, a silence that stretched my nerves to their breaking point. Then, she spoke, her voice choked with emotion, a mixture of horror, fury, and profound, unconditional belief in me. "Mom," she whispered, "I am so sorry I ever doubted you. We have to expose him." Emily, with her youthful energy and tech savviness, became my invaluable ally. She flew in secretly on Saturday evening, her presence a source of immense comfort and strength. Together, we spent hours organizing the evidence, creating a clear, concise presentation. She helped me prepare digital slides of the most damning ledger pages and the casino slips, ensuring they would be easily visible if projected. We decided that the following morning, Sunday service, would be the moment of reckoning. There, in the heart of his supposed domain, surrounded by the congregation he had deceived, the truth would finally be revealed. That Sunday morning, an unnatural calm settled over me. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now overshadowed by a steely resolve. Dressed in my simple Sunday best, with Emily by my side, her hand discreetly holding mine for support, I walked into Havenwood Community Church. The air was thick with the usual pre-service chatter, the scent of coffee and old hymn books. We took a seat towards the front, a deliberate choice. I wanted to see Pastor Finch's face when his world came crashing down. Heads turned as we entered. My presence, especially so prominently seated, was an anomaly, a disruption to their established order. The service began as it always did: hymns, prayers, announcements. Pastor Finch was at his most charismatic, his voice resonant, his smile benevolent. He spoke of community, of trust, of the unwavering truth of Scripture. Each word felt like a personal affront, a testament to his profound hypocrisy. Then came the joys and concerns segment of the service, a time when congregants could share personal updates or prayer requests. This was my moment. Before Pastor Finch could move on, I stood up. My legs felt a little shaky, but my voice, when I spoke, was surprisingly steady. A hush fell over the sanctuary. Every eye in the room turned towards me, a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and for some, I imagined, outright hostility. Emily gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. "I have a concern," I began, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. A deep concern for the truth that was stolen from this church, and from me, 5 years ago. A truth that was buried under lies, alongside a significant amount of this church's money. I paused, letting my words sink in, my gaze fixed on Pastor Finch. His smile faltered, a flicker of unease crossing his features. "And I also have a joy," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "The joy of finally being able to share that truth with all of you today, the truth about who the real thief in Havenwood Community Church is." Without waiting for a response, I nodded to Emily. She connected my small laptop, which she'd discreetly brought in, to the church's projector system. The first image flashed onto the large screen behind the pulpit, the screen usually reserved for hymn lyrics and sermon points, a stark, clear photograph of a page from Pastor Finch's secret black ledger, detailing cash amounts siphoned off, dates, and his cryptic notations. Gasps rippled through the congregation. I began to speak, calmly and methodically, walking them through the evidence. One by one, Emily projected the images, more ledger pages, the casino betting slips bearing dates that coincided with Pastor Finch's supposed seminars, the emails to Jay Rexford discussing investment performance that never appeared on any official church reports. I explained Carol Baxter's testimony about the cash handling, the secret trips. I laid bare the systematic deception, the diversion of funds meant for the Hope and Future Fund and other church resources into high-risk schemes and, apparently, a gambling habit. The atmosphere in the church had transformed from surprised silence to stunned disbelief, then to a low murmur of outrage. Faces in the pews were a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning horror. I recounted how the $50,000 I was accused of taking was just a fraction of the money that had truly vanished under Pastor Finch's stewardship, a convenient smokescreen to cover his much larger, ongoing malfeasance. Pastor Finch, who had initially looked merely surprised, was now pale, his composure visibly cracking. He tried to interrupt, to bluster, his voice rising in indignation. "This is outrageous, lies. Slander from a bitter, discredited woman," he boomed, attempting to regain control. But his protestation sounded hollow against the damning visual evidence displayed for all to see. "Is this a lie, Pastor?" I asked, my voice cutting through his tirade, as Emily projected a close-up of a particularly incriminating betting slip with a date matching one of his pastoral retreats. Or this entry, detailing a Rexford payment that never appeared in any church budget I ever saw. My words, backed by the undeniable proof on the screen, had broken through. The congregation was no longer looking at him with reverence, but with suspicion and a growing anger. The edifice of his authority, built on years of carefully cultivated trust and deception, was crumbling before his very eyes, in the very sanctuary where he had reigned supreme. The reckoning had arrived, not with fire and brimstone, but with the cold, hard light of documented truth. The whispers were no longer about me, they were about him. The tide had turned. The moment I finished speaking, the carefully maintained decorum of Havenwood Community Church shattered. The initial stunned silence erupted into a cacophony of voices. Gasps of disbelief mingled with angry shouts and confused murmurs. People were on their feet, some pointing at the screen, others turning to stare at Pastor Finch with expressions of utter betrayal. The sanctuary, moments before a place of reverent worship, now felt like a courtroom where a guilty verdict had just been delivered. Pastor Finch attempted to rally, his face flushed a deep, mottled red. "This is a malicious fabrication," he thundered, his voice cracking under the strain. "These documents are forged. She is a desperate woman trying to deflect from her own guilt." He appealed to his staunchest supporters, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an ally. "You know me. You know my heart, my dedication to this church." But the visual evidence, stark and damning on the screen behind him, was too powerful to dismiss. His words, once so persuasive, now sounded like the desperate denials of a cornered man. Mr. Arthur Peterson, the head deacon who had so readily condemned me 5 years prior, looked utterly aghast. His jaw worked silently as he stared at the projected ledger pages, the color draining from his face. He seemed to shrink in his pew, the realization of his own unwitting complicity dawning on him with devastating clarity. Mrs. Diane Albright, Pastor Finch's sister, was one of the few who rushed to his defense, her voice shrill with outrage. "How dare you accuse my brother, a man of God, with such vile lies?" she shrieked, advancing towards the front. "He has given his life to this church." But her protests were drowned out by the rising tide of congregational anger and confusion. Members were now openly questioning Finch, demanding answers, their voices laced with pain and a sense of profound disillusionment. "Explain the betting slips, Pastor," one man yelled from the back. "Where did that money come from?" Another woman cried out, her voice trembling. "The Hope and Future Fund. Was it all a lie?" The questions rained down on him, each one a blow to his crumbling authority. He stammered, trying to offer explanations, but his usual eloquence had deserted him. He looked trapped, exposed, his carefully constructed world imploding around him. Several prominent, long-standing church members, their faces grim with shock and determination, quickly moved to the front. One of them, Mr. Harrison, a retired judge known for his calm demeanor and unwavering integrity, addressed the congregation, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Clearly," he stated, his gaze fixed on Pastor Finch, "there are matters here that require immediate and serious investigation by an authority higher than our own board." He announced that he and several others would be contacting the regional denominational leaders immediately to report the situation and request a formal inquiry. Another member, a quiet woman who I knew had legal training, was already on her phone, presumably contacting the police. Throughout this pandemonium, I stood silently by the projector, Emily still steadfastly at my side. I watched as the carefully woven tapestry of Pastor Finch's deceit unraveled thread by painful thread. There was no triumph in my heart, no gloating satisfaction. Instead, I felt a profound, weary sadness for the broken trust, for the faith that had been so cruelly exploited. My personal vindication was almost secondary to the larger tragedy unfolding before me, the betrayal of an entire community. The reactions from those who had once shunned me were varied. Some looked down, their faces etched with shame and regret. Others met my gaze with expressions of dawning understanding and a hesitant, unspoken apology. Mrs. Gable, the elderly widow whose plight had been my final catalyst, was being comforted by another woman, tears streaming down her face, perhaps tears of relief, perhaps of anger at having been so easily duped. The police arrived with surprising speed, their presence adding another layer of surrealism to the scene. They spoke quietly with Mr. Harrison and the other church leaders, then approached Pastor Finch. The sight of our once revered pastor, now looking defeated and small, being formally questioned by law enforcement officers in the very sanctuary where he had preached with such authority, was a stark and sobering image. His reign was definitively over. As the initial shockwaves began to subside, and as Pastor Finch was escorted out of the church by the officers for further questioning, a different kind of quiet descended upon the remaining congregants. It was a quiet filled with unspoken emotions, grief, anger, confusion, and for some, perhaps, a dawning sense of liberation. The truth, however ugly, was out. The festering wound had been lanced. Emily wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "You did it, Mom," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You actually did it." I leaned into her, feeling the exhaustion, both physical and emotional, wash over me. The fallout was immediate and devastating for Pastor Finch, and deeply unsettling for the entire congregation. My name was beginning to be cleared in the court of public opinion, but the cost to the community's heart was immeasurable. The path to healing for Havenwood Community Church would be long and arduous, but it could only begin now that the truth, in all its painful glory, had finally been exposed. The silence of the accusers was, in its own way, the loudest confirmation of my vindication. In the weeks that followed that tumultuous Sunday, Havenwood felt like a town holding its breath. The scandal at the community church was the only topic of conversation, whispered in grocery store aisles, debated in hushed tones at the diner, and analyzed endlessly in homes across our small community. Pastor Alistair Finch was formally suspended by the regional denominational authorities pending a full investigation, and shortly thereafter, he was arrested and charged with multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. His carefully constructed world had not just crumbled, it had been utterly demolished by the weight of the evidence I had brought to light. An interim pastor, a quiet, thoughtful man named Reverend Davies, was appointed to lead Havenwood Community Church. His sermons were gentle, focusing on themes of healing, forgiveness, and the difficult path of rebuilding trust. The pews were noticeably emptier in those initial weeks. Many members were too hurt, too disillusioned, or too ashamed to attend. The vibrant community I had once known was fractured, grappling with the profound betrayal by a leader they had loved and trusted implicitly. For me, those weeks were a period of strange and unexpected adjustment. The heavy cloak of shame and isolation I had worn for 5 long years began to lift, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. It was like a physical weight being removed from my shoulders, allowing me to stand a little taller, to breathe a little deeper. The averted gazes and hushed whispers didn't entirely disappear overnight, but their nature changed. Now, the whispers were often expressions of shock at Pastor Finch's duplicity, or murmurs of sympathy and admiration for my courage. Apologies began to arrive, in various forms. Some were awkward and hesitant, delivered by former friends who bumped into me at the post office or the market. "Sarah," they'd begin, their eyes downcast, we had no idea. We're so sorry for, well, for everything." Others were more direct, heartfelt. Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor who had been the first to relay the news of Pastor Finch's accusatory sermon, came to my door with a freshly baked apple pie, my own specialty, a gesture I understood. Her eyes filled with tears as she stammered out her regret for having doubted me, for having been so quick to believe the worst. I accepted these apologies with a quiet dignity. There was no bitterness in my heart, surprisingly little anger left. The fight had been to uncover the truth, not to exact revenge on those who had been misled. The real culprit was facing the consequences of his actions, and that was justice enough for me. My focus was on rebuilding my own shattered peace, on reclaiming the life that had been put on hold for so long. Emily stayed with me for a week after the confrontation, her presence a constant source of comfort and validation. We talked for hours, truly talked, in a way we hadn't been able to for years. The unspoken strain that had shadowed our relationship was gone, replaced by a renewed closeness, a deeper understanding. She marveled at my resilience, but I told her it was her unwavering belief in those final, crucial days that had given me the final surge of strength I needed. Knowing she stood with me, that she would be there to help present the truth, had made all the difference. Slowly, tentatively, I began to re-engage with the world. I started taking my morning walks again, not for errands this time, but for the simple pleasure of the fresh air and the gentle rhythm of movement. I found I could meet people's eyes again without flinching, without that ingrained sense of shame. The haunted look in my own reflection began to recede, replaced by a quiet strength, a newfound self-possession. I wasn't the same Sarah Jenkins I had been before the accusation. That woman, in many ways, was gone forever. But the woman who emerged from the ashes was stronger, wiser, and perhaps, in a strange way, more truly herself than ever before. I even started baking again. Not for church bake sales, not yet. But for myself, for Emily while she was there, for Mrs. Henderson as a gesture of accepted apology. The familiar motions of measuring flour, kneading dough, the scent of cinnamon and apples filling my kitchen, these simple acts were profoundly healing, a way of reconnecting with a part of myself I thought I had lost. The transformation was not just external, not just about how others saw me. It was deeply internal. The ordeal had stripped away so much, but it had also revealed a core of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. I had faced down my accuser, armed only with the truth and a desperate courage. I had navigated a path of fear and uncertainty, and I had emerged, not unscathed, but whole. There were scars, of course, invisible wounds that would likely always remain. But they were no longer the defining features of my existence. They were reminders of a battle fought and won. The legal proceedings against Pastor Finch were ongoing, and the church community was slowly beginning its own difficult journey towards reconciliation and reform. My role in that part of the story was largely over. I had delivered the truth. It was up to others now to deal with the consequences and rebuild. My task was to nurture my own healing, to cultivate my own small patch of peace. I had walked through fire and found, on the other side, not a return to my old life, but the beginning of a new one, built on a foundation of hard-won truth and an unshakable sense of self. The silence I had endured for so long had finally given way to the clear, strong voice of my own reclaimed integrity. Months passed, and the rhythms of Havenwood slowly began to find a new, more somber cadence. The sensationalism surrounding Pastor Finch's downfall eventually faded, replaced by the more practical and painful work of communal healing and institutional reform. The legal process, as it often does, moved with a deliberate slowness. But in time, justice, in its formal sense, was served. Alistair Finch was convicted on multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. His sentence was significant, a clear message that such betrayals of trust, especially by those in positions of spiritual leadership, would not be tolerated. News also trickled in that Mr. Rexford's shady investment operations were facing wider scrutiny from federal authorities, a small, satisfying footnote to the main drama. Havenwood Community Church, under the steady guidance of Reverend Davies and a newly elected, more transparent board, embarked on the arduous task of rebuilding. They instituted stringent new financial controls, held open meetings to address congregants' concerns, and made a public apology for the institutional failings that had allowed Pastor Finch's deception to continue for so long. It was a long road ahead for them, a journey of regaining not just financial stability, but the far more precious commodity of trust. As for me, I chose not to return to Havenwood Community Church as a member. The memories there, though now overlaid with the vindication of truth, were still too painfully entwined with the trauma of the accusation and the years of isolation. The building itself, the familiar hymns, the faces of the congregation, they all carried echoes of a past I was ready to move beyond. Instead, I found a small, unassuming congregation in a neighboring town. It was a simpler place, less grand, but the people were warm and welcoming, their faith expressed through quiet acts of kindness and genuine fellowship. There, I could worship authentically, without the weight of history, and slowly, carefully, begin to nurture my own bruised but resilient faith. The desire for vengeance, which had briefly flared during the darkest days of my planning, had completely dissipated. Seeing Pastor Finch exposed, his reputation in tatters, his freedom curtailed, that was consequence, not revenge. My victory was not in his downfall, but in the reclamation of my own name, my own peace of mind. The greatest satisfaction came from the quiet moments, enjoying a guilt-free cup of coffee at the corner booth, receiving a genuine smile from a former acquaintance, hearing Emily's laughter on the phone, unclouded by doubt or worry. I didn't forget the pain, the injustice, or the crushing loneliness of those 5 years. Such experiences become a part of who you are, etching themselves into your soul. But they no longer defined me. I was not Sarah Jenkins, the falsely accused treasurer. I was Sarah Jenkins, a woman who had faced profound adversity and found an unexpected strength within herself. A woman who had learned that even in the deepest darkness, the pursuit of truth could be a guiding light. Inspired by my own ordeal, and by the quiet support I eventually received, I started something new, something small and informal. Once a month, I hosted a gathering in my home for women in our county who had faced their own significant injustices or betrayals, women who had been disbelieved, dismissed, or silenced. We shared our stories, not for pity, but for solidarity, for the shared understanding that can only come from walking through similar fires. In sharing my own journey, from accusation to vindication, I found a new purpose: to offer a small beacon of hope, a reminder that resilience is possible, that truth, however long it takes, can indeed set you free. My life now is quieter than it once was, perhaps less outwardly ambitious than when I dreamed of building youth centers. But it is also richer, imbued with a deeper appreciation for the simple entities of honesty, kindness, and the hard-won peace that comes from living in alignment with one's own truth. The roses Mark planted in the garden still bloom every summer, their beauty a quiet testament to endurance and renewal. They took my name, my community, my peace for a time. But they couldn't take my truth. And in the end, it was the truth, painstakingly unearthed and bravely spoken, that truly set me free. The scars remain, a reminder of the battle, but they no longer hurt. They are simply part of the map of a life lived, a life reclaimed. And in my small garden, under the quiet Havenwood sky, I finally found my peace. My story is one among many, a testament to the strength found in adversity and the enduring power of truth. If you've journeyed with me through these memories and found something that resonates, I'd be so grateful if you would subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Give this video a like, and perhaps let us know in the comments what city or town you're listening from today. It's always heartwarming to know how far these stories can reach. Thank you for listening.